Hi everyone, I'm glad that you are here at Humans of Authenticity. My name is Vili and I'll be your host. Our guest today is Jeff de Cagna, and I look forward to this conversation so much. Jeff is the executive advisor of Foresight First in Reston, Virginia. He has been instrumental in fostering the culture of foresight, as I've observed in our sector, so that we can prioritize the future as part of our daily conversations. It's also, for me, help us to challenge our belief system so that we can grow as an association. He is an ASAE Fellow and a recipient of the ASAE Academy of Leaders Award, the association's highest individual honors given to a consultant or industry partner in recognition of the support of ASAE and the association community. He is very well known in our industry. Welcome to Humans of Authenticity, Jeff.
Thank you, V. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a real privilege. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Would you like to introduce yourself to our listener first?
Sure. So yeah, I've been in the association world, as you sort of alluded to, for more than 30 years. I think this is my probably my 33rd year in the association community, and I started out as a staff person back in the well, in my day it was the early 90s. Now I guess we refer to it as the late 1900s. But so yeah, it's in the early 90s I started out working on staff in various associations. I worked twice for the Greater Washington Society of Association Executives when it still existed in the DC area, which was a great experience having that opportunity. And then in 2002, I started out on my own and have been doing that ever since. And this is the 23rd year of the consulting work. And yeah, it's been an exciting run, doing a lot of different things over that time, working on innovation, working with boards, doing a lot of speaking and doing work on foresight and all that. And I know the focus of our discussion today will be around learning. And I think for me, all of those things that I've done in my work, whether it's innovation or working with boards or foresight, the connective tissue, if you will, what ties them all together is the focus on learning. So it's been fun. It's exciting, and looking forward to continuing my work on behalf of the association community going forward.
You mentioned you started within the associations and then you move away towards consultants. Was there a trigger for that change? Was there a calling to move towards the consultant side?
There was definitely a desire to, well, I guess the way that I would say it is, working on staff in an individual organization never felt like the greatest fit for me. I sometimes, early in my career, would refer to myself as an organizational misfit. It just wasn't, like I didn't do well inside the organization. I felt that I could have more impact as someone who was working with multiple organizations instead of one organization at a time. And so the idea of working in one organization just, after a while became more stultifying than interesting and compelling. So there was that. And of course, the inciting event, if you will, for moving in this direction was in my last association job. I was actually restructured out of that job. And so and this was not a great time for that to happen, by the way, because it happened about 6 weeks after 9/11.
Oh,
And so it was a difficult time, but it was actually the thing that I needed. It was the push that I needed to go in this direction. And because I had been working with a coach for a number of years, and this was the substance of our discussion, pretty much every meeting was really about making this shift from being an executive association staff person to working on the consulting side. And so that was the push I needed, losing that job and moving on, having the opportunity to move on to something else. It wasn't an easy decision because, as I said, it was a challenging time in the economy, not the greatest time to be thinking about starting a new venture necessarily in that late 2001, early 2002 timeframe. But, my wife is an amazing person, and we talked about it, and she, gave me the flexibility to make that decision. And I feel like it was absolutely the right decision to make for so many reasons. And it has allowed me to fulfill, or at least moving, I don't think I'm fulfilled yet, but moving closer to what I want to do, which is really to help, our community be as strong as possible to help association boards become more. And, that I'm able to do that because I made that decision with the support of my partner. And I'm glad that I was able to do that.
Thank you for sharing that. Are you okay for us to unpack that stories a little bit more?
Absolutely.
So the first thing that I heard from your story at the earlier part was you described there was a misfit feeling.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Can you describe what that feel like, how that looked like? Was there a particular story that you can share with us?
I think I felt this particularly acutely in my last job, which was my job on the senior staff in my last association, because I felt like there were so many things that I wanted to do, but there was no way to do them all. Right. And I felt like that was what made it stultifying. Like, I wanted to experiment, I wanted to innovate, I wanted to try a number of things. And there were a lot of things that I was essentially, I had to do. And because I was a senior staff person, because I had a team and that sort of thing. And look, I loved working with my team, they were great. But, it was a challenge to sort of feed myself while also trying to manage all these other responsibilities. Excuse me. So I'm like, management is not sort of naturally, something that I enjoy. Like, it's something I can do, but it's not necessarily the thing that really gives me the experience I'm looking for. As someone who is focused on learning, I really want to do things that feed the learning process. So I think that was a part of it. I think that dealing, with just some of the internal politics around things, which of course I still deal with as a consultant, but in a different way. I can take a step back from some of that in my current role versus, the way you're sort of embroiled in it when you are on the senior team and when you're, in the staff organization. This was not particularly the most important thing, but it's, you asked for a story. So it's sort of emblematic of what the frustration was, at the time that I was working there. And again, we're going back now to, this was the late 1990s, this particular job. And actually, it was, my mistake, was actually early 2000. So it's still 23, 24 years ago that we're talking about. I wrote an article for a magazine in the association community, and the title of the article was Destroy Mediocrity. And the whole premise of the article was that we've got to move our organizations beyond being mediocre and being to a place where we can really have an impact on the lives of the people we serve and on our society. And it was the cover story, and it had a big, headline, Destroy Mediocrity. Well, it was published, and then I got called into the executive director's office and got yelled at. Basically, I got put on a couch and he yelled at me, not as he said, not necessarily because he disagreed with what I wrote, but because he did not, I had not told him it was coming, right? And I had not given him a heads up. And I think that's probably fair. I should have told him. It just didn't occur to me, to be perfectly honest. I did not think it was that big a deal. I had written many articles even before I got there. And so he actually asked me to write a letter to him, reaffirming my commitment to stay at the organization, which I did. And I did stay, and until, he left, he retired, and the new person came in, and that new person decided to make the change that led to my losing my job. So, yeah, so I think that whole situation, I wanted to write, I wanted to speak, I wanted to do those kinds of things. It can be a little more challenging to do that when you are on staff. At least it was at that time. Maybe it's different in 2024 versus back at that time. So I think it was just an experience, a series of experiences that I had that left me feeling like, if this is all that I can do, I won't be able to really make an impact, a meaningful impact, even within these four walls, much less beyond these four walls. And that's something I wanted to do. I really wanted to make an impact in our community. And so, yeah, so I think that was all of those things, plus a lot of other things I'm sure that I have forgotten about by now, were factors in saying, okay, I really need to be in a space where I am able to shape things more to my liking, to be able to deliver value to a lot of organizations, have a lot of different experiences. And I'm incredibly fortunate that I've been able to do that for the last 20 plus years and have a measure of success at being able to sustain it.
Thank you so much for sharing that story. And I'm sorry that you had to go through that experience.
No problem.
I guess things like that reminds me of a lot of the thing that we don't want then happen to be blessing in disguise. I heard of a story about being let go from a lot of my amazing and highly achieved colleagues, but unfortunately it still happens to a lot of us. Are you comfortable to share? And feel free to say no to this next question. I'm curious, for that period of after being let go, how long did it take for you to gain your confidence back again? Or does that even impact you mentally at all?
It took me about a month. So this all happened in October of 2001. So probably toward the second half of October. I keep saying it's about 6 weeks, and that sounds about right to me. And it was a rather unceremonious process of being let go, being called to a 7 a.m. meeting downtown DC in a meeting room at a hotel, all the way in the basement of the hotel. Myself and two other senior people, with my boss in the room and the executive director. My boss was the number two. All the senior team reported to the number two. And the HR person basically being told, we're making a change, you're being let go. Here are the severance, envelopes. Give us your keys. Don't come to the office. We'll send you your stuff. It was not fun. It was not a fun experience. And I was stunned. I was shocked, by it. I did not really think it was going to happen. And then when I hit that, and I couldn't even call my wife from where the meeting was happening because it was so far underground. Cell service didn't work. So I had to wait till I got to the street to call her to tell her what had happened. And so, yeah, it was dismaying. And again, as I said earlier, the timing of it wasn't great, right? Because it was, the economy and the world were in a state of, tremendous upheaval after 9/11. And so it took me about a month of sitting on the couch, trying to figure out what went wrong and trying to get over, what had happened. But then after a while, I just decided, okay, I'm done. I'm done being upset about it. I'm done, with the woe is me around it. I'm done with all that stuff. And that's when I said, okay, I'm going to start doing this. And by early November, I had already secured the name for my company. And so I was ready to get going, which is why I was able to start really, so quickly. My start date for the consulting part of my career, I guess you could say, was February 1 of 2002. So I did not wait for very long to get going. And so, yeah, it took me about a month. And, I thought about it, of course, after that month. I can't say, it wasn't like turning off the faucet and then you never turn it back on again. But it wasn't dominant because I was much more focused on what was coming next
Mhm.
and much more focused on the opportunities that provided, which is why I was able to move quickly to get started just a few months after it happened. And of course, the holidays were in there. So that was also helped to delay things a little bit because of the holiday season. And so yeah, but the good news I can say of this is, years later, so I started in 2002, probably about 6 years later, another new executive director came into that organization, and I had met her, and she hired me to come do some work with that organization as a consultant, right? And some of the same people who were on the board or who were around the organization when I was there were still there,
Right.
so I got to see them. And I can also say, and I don't mean this to, I hope this doesn't sound, too sort of sort of self-aggrandizing, because I don't mean it that way. It was just an interesting dynamic that I had not experienced before, because I'd never had anything like this happen before. I had lost, jobs before, but not quite in this way, right? So the executive director, who actually was the person who initiated my being let go in 2001, did not last in her role beyond February of 2002. And the day she was let go, I got phone calls from people who knew what had happened to me, people I had worked with, to tell me that she had been let go by the organization. So she barely was in her job for maybe 5 months. And so I didn't take any pleasure in that. I was, some people who called me did take pleasure in it, I could say. I did not take any pleasure in that because I know how hard, I understood very well how hard it is to lose a job. But what I took away from it was the fact that even though I didn't know it at the time when the job ended, that there were people out there who were in my corner, and they were supportive. And apparently, after these terminations were made, this is what I was told by a board member, there was a lot of yelling at the next board meeting about some of the decisions that were made around it. So it was not a popular choice, and the decisions that were made around these terminations. And, it's all water under the bridge at this point. It's more than 20 years ago. So it's not anything I worry about. But what I feel good about is that ultimately it all turned around, right? I was not only able to get over what had happened, but I was able to actually go back, to work again with that organization in a different way, in a different role, and see some of the same people and have them know that not only did I survive what happened, but I was thriving.
Thank you again for sharing that. And I think all of the conversations that you have with your colleagues afterwards, that spoke volumes to your credibility and the work that you've done and the way that you show up while you're still working with them. I want to flip the coin on this story. Let's say if you're speaking with someone who were recently let go from the organization, is there a word of wisdom that you would share with them to help them going through and process through what's been going on?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, having been there on more than one occasion in my own career, I think that anyone who's facing that situation should know that. And of course, let me preface this by saying that the dynamics of the workforce and the workplace in 2024 are quite different than the dynamics of 2001, 2002, right? It's a lot more complicated with the whole, return to the office, work from home, all those permutations, the introduction of technology, and, so on. So everything has to be situated in the context of today versus the context of 23 years ago. Having said all that, I think that the message remains the same, which is that this moment, even though it feels like it will define you forever, it will not. In the moment that you are told, the basic message is you're no longer welcome here, right? You're done, right? That's a very hard thing for us to accept, right? It's painful to be cut loose in that way. And especially, in ways like what happened to me with that, being summoned to an early morning meeting in a hotel and that kind of thing. And I'm sure others have faced far worse situations than that. And so I think that, this does not define you for your entire life. It's a moment in time. And the best thing you can do is, yes, absolutely take some time to get over it. I think that it's fair to say that losing a job, certainly, I think psychologists say this, that losing a job can be akin to any other form of grief that one feels in your life. So get over, work through your grief, right? I shouldn't say get over it because you don't always get over it, but work through the grief and then use it as energy. I'll use it as fuel to do what's next, to find the next opportunity. Because I think one thing that is even better than 2002 is that there's a lot more opportunity out there for you to find something that you want to do, that you could be good at, and you could make an impact in your own way, right? So yeah, I think that we shouldn't allow these situations to define us, even though psychologically we do that. Like it's a very natural reaction.
Yeah.
But I think, I'm sure that through your conversations with people on this podcast and just in life, everyone's faced something like this at some point in their lives, whether they've lost a job or left a job because they had a terrible boss or whatever it was. Something to do with their work caused them to reach an inflection point that moved them away from where they were. And perhaps they thought at the time that this defines me forever. And the reality is it does not. And your choices, you have more agency to be able to not allow it to define you forever, right? I talk about what happened 23 years ago. No one else does. No one else remembers unless I talk about it, right? So yeah, we need to trust in ourselves more and feel better about ourselves. And I think, again, because for me, learning is such a defining part of what I've done throughout my career and really throughout my life, I suppose. I think that learning is always a pathway to get out of those feelings of this is going to define me forever. The more that you are able to prioritize learning and focus on that, the more opportunities you will find, the less you will worry about what happened before. Obviously, everyone has immediate concerns when they lose their job. How will I pay my bills? And that sort of thing. You have to find employment, whatever form that takes. Setting aside those issues, which of course have to be addressed, the learning that one does always opens new opportunities and new pathways to be able to get beyond the feelings of, whatever, the feelings of regret, the feelings of disappointment, the feelings of frustration that go along with that sort of thing. So for me, I think that's the most important message. This does not define you. It's just one moment in time, and then you move forward and keep moving forward and use learning and use the fuel of frustration and regret and everything like that to power you onto the next big thing that you want to do.
Thank you so much. And that's the wise words of Jeff de Cagna. 20 so years later, he's the leader in Foresight in this sector. Thank you again for traveling to past with me. I have one last question before we move to the next part of the conversation. Throughout the last 20 years or so, and I know that it goes more than that, if there is one thing that is uniquely you, that define you, the one thing that led you to who you are, the person today, what would that be?
Wow, that's really interesting. I think I was asked a similar question recently in another podcast, and I think I would have to answer it in the same way, which is the willingness that I have had to challenge what I refer to as orthodox beliefs, to be a contrarian. Like if you go to my LinkedIn profile, at the very top there, you'll see those descriptors I use for myself. And one of those, the very first one, is association contrarian. And just for the record, the reason why it's first is because it comes first alphabetically, not because I'm trying to lead with it. It just happens to fit there because of A is the first letter. But I think that in some ways, for me, is what has defined what I've done. And that too is a form of learning, right? It's like the idea is that we have to challenge our deep-seated assumptions about how the world works. And in this context, it's the orthodoxy of association management, the orthodoxy that exists inside our associations and in our community and, in our boards and that kind of thing. So I think I have been willing to do that, even though it hasn't always been popular, even though it hasn't endeared me, to everyone. And, it is a challenging space to occupy because, there's going to be a lot of people who are like, okay, please just shut up, and can we just get on, and I get that, right? Because when I'm talking about they are difficult conversations. I always say when I'm working with a board and we're having an orthodoxy conversation, which is almost always the first really deep conversation I have with them, it's the toughest conversation we have, but it's the one that is most necessary to start with because it's the orthodoxy that is getting in the way of our learning, right? It's the orthodoxy that's preventing us from being able to navigate our way toward the future. So I think that being willing to be a contrarian and recognizing the importance of pushing back on orthodoxy is something that I have been willing to do, and I'm glad that I have, because I think now it has become it's part of it's in the bloodstream, if you will, of our community, that we have to be able to push back on our assumptions. And so, I think that's probably the thing that has really defined what I've tried to do in many ways over the course of my entire consulting career.
That is a perfect cue for us to move into the keyword discussion. Which word do you select for us to talk about today?
It is learning. I think I probably let that cat out of the bag a little too early, for things, but yes, the word is learning.
Now, we all know that it is important to be a learner, but can you give me some of the rewards at the end of the learning curve, some of your motivations in being a continuous learner?
So, I think that I'm keenly aware of the fact that in my life, luck has played a very, big role, right? I'm incredibly lucky to have been born, in America, to have been born a white man, to have been born to parents who cared about me and who wanted the very best for me and gave me, everything they could in terms of, life lessons and motivation and a positive sense of self and that sort of thing. And I was lucky to go to great schools and have a great education. I was lucky to find a life partner who supported the person that I am and who allowed me to support her. And so on. So much of my life has been defined by luck. And the reason why I think learning is so important is because we can't control, our luck, but we can be better prepared for when life is showing us opportunities. And I think the way we get there, the way we take advantage or capitalize best on our luck is by being ready to see the opportunities and act upon them. And learning allows us to do that, right? And so I think for me, that has been a key thing. Going back to, when I was in elementary school, and one of my teachers in third grade saw something in me and, gave the school district my name to be a part of the very first, what they called HAP, the High Aptitude Program, gifted and talented kind of thing. I have no idea if that was true, but she saw something in me. And, so at a very early age, someone said to me, you've got some kind of gift that you should use and we should try to develop further. And my parents were supportive of that. My mom particularly was always supportive of my sense of curiosity, and always, if I wanted to buy books, when I was in elementary school, we used to get these Scholastic sheets where we'd order books and we turn them into the teacher. And then the best days were when the boxes arrived with the books, everyone would get their books. And anytime I wanted to buy books, my mom was like, go for it, right? She never told me not to buy books. It's obviously in the world before the internet. And so throughout my childhood and into high school and into college and into graduate school, I always felt, that I had that desire to learn. And in many ways, it helped me. Again, I can't control my luck. I've had a lot of really great luck, but I feel like I've been better prepared, for everything that's come my way. And so that I feel, quite grateful. I mean, I think there's so many words that go into this. I'm talking about luck and I'm tying it to learning, but it's about gratitude and it's about appreciation and it's about a desire to, help other people. I think one of the biggest moments in my life was having the opportunity to go to graduate school at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and spend, an academic year there. It's a highly intensive 1-year program, which is really designed for teachers who are taking a sabbatical so they can do it in a single year away from school. But it's open to anyone who wants to go there. And what was powerful about going to Harvard for me was having had a strong sense before I got there about things that I felt about learning and the way that I saw what learning could be, that learning could be a transformative experience for people. But I didn't know how to talk about it because I didn't have that vocabulary. And then I went to school and I got that vocabulary, right? That's what I learned. And so for me, it's a very meta experience because it was a transformative experience for me, diving into the impact of learning as a transformative experience for other people, right? I was one of the few people in my class who was focused on adults. The ed school at Harvard is much more focused on K through 12 and then higher education. There are very few people, at least back at that time, which is in the sort of mid to late 90s, who went there as adult learning people, which is what I did. And there were probably, fewer than 10 of us in our class who were totally focused on adults. Someone who was, a trainer at a bank, someone who was a prison educator, someone who was a literacy teacher or, a teacher of English as a second language. And I was in many ways quite unique because I had been working in associations doing association education. So no one there had done that. So that was very much out of the mainstream from the people who were the adult educators in the group, the very few of us. And we'd meet and talk about things. And for me, looking at transformative learning and getting to understand learning in that way, not learning as a training exercise, not learning as, sort of pouring information into people's heads, but, and not even learning as being more problem solving based, which is one of the distinctions that they often make, they meaning the people who write about adult learning. The distinction between the way we teach children and the way we teach adults is that, or at least according to the theory, is a major factor is that adults want to be engaged in problem solving, like help them solve problems through their learning, and that's how they learn, right? And yes, I agree that's true. And actually what you learn in graduate school of education is that the techniques and approaches that work with children also work with adults. And the techniques that work with adults also work with children, right? There's not as much, it's not as divided as one might think, even though there can be ways of talking about it that suggest that it is more divided. And so for me, I was not really looking at learning as a training exercise. I was not looking at learning as how can I put more information into people's heads. I was looking at learning, and I've tried ever since I got my degree to look at learning through the lens of how can this transform someone. Like I had a professor, in graduate school who would say, let's talk about transformation, right? What does that mean, right? Transformation is literally the idea that the form, right? Because that word form is in the word transformation, right? The form itself is at risk, right? When you're transforming, you are changing the form in some meaningful and substantive way, right? And that's the kind of learning that I had when I was in graduate school. And that's the kind of learning I wanted to support when I got out of graduate school. I wanted to do learning that would put the form at risk, if you will, right? And the form being the learners that I was working with in some meaningful and substantive way so that they could have some of the experience that I had, right? And I think, the final point that I'll make about this, sort of the direction I'll take on this is, in many ways, that's the reason why when I came back to the association community and I went back into staff at that point, and again, it was not a satisfying experience. What I knew was that if I could get into a place where I could do some of that kind of transformation through my work, whether it was through innovation or whether it was through foresight or whether it's through working with boards, that really what I'm trying to do, and I think this has become particularly true in these last many years, these most recent years, when I've been working with boards and I've been working on foresight and working beyond, even just the foresight piece to think about stewardship, governing, and foresight, and coining the term the duty of foresight, back in 2014, and writing about that and talking about that for these last 10 years. That really what I've been trying to do is put the form at risk, right? The form of the board, the form of the way that boards function, the form of the way our associations operate, the way our community thinks about things. And I haven't really talked about it in this way for a very long time, but actually this feels really good to me, to be able to talk about it in this way, because that's really still inside me, even though it's not necessarily what comes out when I talk about it, when I'm with a board or I'm doing a session or something like that. But that's really the issue, the mindset that I was able to get for so many reasons, and many, many others that I won't take any more time on right now. But the learning piece has been such a central part of how I've gotten, to where I am and any success that I've had. And again, with so much gratitude to everyone in my life who's made that possible. And with a feeling that I have a responsibility to help others get to that same place, because I feel like I've been given a gift and I want to be able to give that, help others find that gift for themselves or give that gift, to them as well. And so, yeah, that's where I am with all that.
Thank you so much. You gave me a lot of material to unpack here. Before we get to the questions, I want to pause. You mentioned the bit about fortunate and luck earlier in your story. I just want to pause and recognize that it is also your hard work and dedication that bring to where you are today as well. I feel that luck happened to more people around us, but this is our attitude towards what we receive that will turn to something meaningful, right? So I do want to recognize your dedications in the space as well. You also mentioned that you're grateful for a lot of people around you. Would you like to shout out to someone special on this channel?
Well, I mean, she's going to be quite upset the fact that I'm doing this, and that's my wife, because everyone who knows me knows that I talk about her all the time because she is an exceptional person in so many ways. And she's like, you have to stop talking about me. And I'm like, that's not going to happen. So, we'll have to figure out another way. But yeah, I mean, obviously, my parents, they're no longer with me. We talked about this ahead of time. This is today, we're recording this on my birthday. And so on this day, I feel their absence, more acutely. Of course, I feel it every day, but especially today. But I think also on this day, which is another milestone in my life, I feel an enormous sense of gratitude to Meg, my wife, for making it possible for me to be able to go to Harvard, right? It was, were it not for her, it would not have been possible. It was her idea for me to apply, right? And when I was accepted, it was because she was willing to support that decision and the sacrifice that went along with it, because we were apart during that academic year. I was up in Cambridge and she was at home. I gave up a job, right? So that was hard. And she supported everything I've tried to do, with the work I've done on the consulting side. And so yeah, I mean, were it not for her, love and support and everything that goes along with it, none of this would have been possible. So I always like to say that, my parents made my life possible, and Meg has made me possible for, now it's more than 60% of my life. We've been married for almost 32 years now. So yeah, so I mean, it's Meg, and of course there are so many I've had wonderful bosses who gave me opportunities. I've had wonderful clients over these many years. I just, I feel incredibly grateful to all of those people who, in whatever way, have been a part of this process for me and this experience, which continues, right? I'm not delivering a valedictory here. It's just a reflection on, where I am on this particular day. So yeah, I'm just being always filled with that sense of appreciation for others and gratitude for others' generosity, and want to try to do everything I can to reciprocate not only to them, but to everyone in our community and everyone that I encounter in my life.
Thank you for that. Happy birthday.
Thanks.
Thank you for spending your birthday with me, actually, even though by the time that this episode released, we would have passed that. But I'm sure Jeff will appreciate the belated birthday wish as well. And also here to your parents, I'm sorry about that. Here to your parents, here to Meg, so that we can have Jeff today. Now go back to your stories. There are a lot of things that you say throughout the stories that I want to revisit, and I'd love to, if you can share some stories and some examples so
Sure.
that we understand the inner context better.
Sure.
You mentioned that throughout your learning journey, it helps you to see opportunity, act upon it, and learning allows you to do that. Is there stories that you can bring this to life for us?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think really it's the story of how my consulting work has evolved, because when I started out in 2002, I had just come out of the world of libraries. And so, when you're early on in your, self-employed career, you look for any opportunity that you can find for which people will pay you. I mean, that's the literal reality of starting out a new business. You've got to find people who want to hire you to do things. So I started doing a lot of work in the library space because I just come from there. But what I really wanted to do was the innovation work, because that was really what, I was really excited about. And because I had been writing about innovation and talking about innovation even while I was still on staff. And so going out on my own, I really wanted innovation to be the thing. So I just did everything I could to figure out and learn how to make innovation something that associations would want to talk about. Because in 2002, I can tell you there was not a lot of discussion about innovation in associations. It was not a hot topic at that time for us. And so I've often described, that I sort of think about my consulting career as a little bit of the Sisyphean myth of, the Greek mythical king who was pushing the boulder uphill, trying to get it to the top, and it would never get quite all the way there. And he'd have to go back down and do it again and over again for his entire life. And that's how the innovation conversation felt in 2002 and for a very long time thereafter, because there was just not a lot of focus on that in the association community back in that time. And, so I tried to learn, even though I had a lot of background and knowledge already from having, studied it in a variety of ways, even while I was on staff, looking at innovation and trying to implement it in my work. I went further and, I went to MIT and got a certificate in strategy and innovation. I tried to build my understanding of these issues more deeply. And even as I got into innovation, I started to get more focused on certain kinds of innovation that I thought would be more effective in associations, like business model innovation. And so I moved into that area and did a lot of work with business model innovation, again, through an ongoing process of learning how can I help bring the idea of business model innovation into the association community. After I became less interested in the innovation conversation, which took some time, it took me about 13 years to get to the place where, like, okay, this innovation conversation doesn't hold the same interest for me in 2015 as it did in 2002. That's when I started thinking about what was next. And throughout that time that I've been doing innovation work, I'd been spending a lot of time working with boards and a lot of time looking at, because boards, quite honestly, were the major impediment to innovation in associations. They were the ones who were risk averse and did not want to do this work. And I heard that from CEOs. I would do innovation sessions for ASAE, and the CEOs would say, hey, we love this. This is great, but we can't do anything because our boards won't let us do it, right? And so I said, okay, well, I guess I'm going to have to start doing something with boards. And so I started, I did not set out to want to be, board consultant. I set out to want to do innovation work and then find my way. So I did everything I could to learn as much as possible, with boards about, what boards were about and what they needed to understand. I wrote articles about it for ASA and other publications, and I spoke about it, in public sessions and that kind of thing. And all of that, by the way, all of that's learning, right? Whether you're writing about it or you're talking about it in a session, or you're reading a book or you're listening to a podcast or whatever, that's all learning, right? It's all just different forms of learning. And so then the evolution of that became a shift toward the board work, which was really confirmed in a sense by the article that I wrote for Associations Now, in which I coined the term the duty of foresight in 2014. And because that was, in many ways, for me personally, the apex of saying, okay, this is the intersection point of a focus on learning, a focus on the future, a focus on boards, right? A focus on stronger associations and a stronger community. It was all there in those three words, right, for me. And when I coined that term and I wrote that article in 2014, I realized that it was something important, and I wanted to continue working on it. And that was what led me down the pathway to move away from the innovation conversation and being, the name of my company when I started out was Principled Innovation. And then in 2017, I changed it to Foresight First. It took me a couple of years to get from my initial sort of inner monologue about why I wanted to stop focusing on innovation to the point where I made the transition to really become Foresight First. So I've been doing this work for a lot longer, but Foresight First has only been around now for 7 years. And it was an important decision because it really pushed me into even more areas of learning around foresight. I had the opportunity to go to the Oxford Scenarios program. Even before all this started, I went to the Oxford Scenarios program in the UK in 2011. I went to training at the Institute for the Future in Palo Alto in 2015. And I've done a whole bunch of other things since then. And now in 2020, really, it's even predates this, but the next iteration of this in many ways, even though my focus on boards will remain, is this new focus on artificial intelligence, right? Something that I've been studying for a very long time on my own and doing a lot of research and talking about it and writing about it. But because of what's happened in the last 18 months or so with the, tremendous acceleration of the impact of AI brought about by generative AI and ChatGPT and the whole nine yards, I've once again gone back to what I would normally do, reading and learning as much as possible, gathering up as much information. I'm not a technologist, but I am a learning person. Even though I've advocated for technology for many years, I now have a sort of a different view of where we are in terms of how technology affects our society and affects our organizations. And I've gone out and once again tried to pull together, the kind of learning and credentials that will support, the conversation in, doing a program or, a learning process through the Institute for Artificial Intelligence Management and through the London School of Economics and through the Diligent Institute, doing learning that focuses on boards, that focuses on AI ethics, that focuses on that. So each one of these steps that I've taken over the course of these last 23 years now, and of course it predates that, but specifically in the consulting phase of my career, has been about moving to the next thing, the next opportunity, and then using the learning process of try to get to that place. And so yeah, so that will continue, right? I mean, that will continue. There will be something after AI. I don't know what it is yet, but I know there will be something else, right? And so I'll continue doing until I decide that I'm, ready to retire. And I don't know exactly when that will be. It's not soon, but it's also not 30 years away. There will continue to be, that process of identification, sense making around what the opportunities are, meaning making around their implications for me and for this community, and then decision making about how to pursue them, right? That's the cycle of learning that I talk about with boards and talk about in my sessions, and that we all pursue quite naturally. We just don't name it, right? Sense making, meaning making, decision making. But that's the basic cycle of learning that we all go through. And that's what I've tried to do. I just make it explicit. So yeah, that's how it's worked for me. And it'll continue.
Thank you for that. Throughout that story you just shared, I've heard something about the new knowledge that you have obtained become something that contradict with your own belief system and value. Did I hear that correctly?
Well, yeah, I mean, if one is going to look at learning as a transformative process, then as I said earlier, one has to be willing to put the form at risk, right? So for me, the AI process, the AI work of learning has been about a fundamental shift in my thinking, and in many ways, and I've said this in certain situations, and so I'll say it here because, this is not something that I'm trying to hide. It just doesn't come up that much. Yeah, I wrote a lot of stuff and I wrote a lot of articles before the pandemic, right? Before we got into lockdown. And even in the years leading up to that period, sort of the late 2010s and into the 2020s. I often feel like I go back and read some of the things that I wrote back at that time, back in the early 2010s, the mid 2010s. And I'm like, you know what? I shouldn't have written this. Like, this is not great advice for associations. And it's not like I was trying in some ways to help associations become something that they were not. We shouldn't be trying to make our organizations into, kind of a poor man's version of Google or a poor man's version of Amazon. That's not who we are, right? We should be who we are, right? The pandemic really was that shift toward everything that happened, especially in the first few years of this decade, was really an important inflection point for me personally, as well as I think for our community, to say, we need to be in a different place. And so my focus on AI began before the pandemic, but then transitioned into where we are now. And my whole mindset as a result of ongoing learning and ongoing reflection and ongoing thinking shifted from where I think a lot of people are today with AI, which is, isn't this really awesome and cool? And look at all these use cases and, that sort of thing. And we can get summaries of our articles and they can write emails for us and we'll all be all super productive. And, so isn't that exciting? And I saw all the opportunities. So I talked about AI and said, wow, look at all these things we could do with AI. And as I've seen it shift over the course of the last many years, I've gone in the other direction to say, yeah, AI has value. We should think about carefully how we're going to use it. But it's much more important that we focus on humanity than on technology. It's much more important that we focus on ethics than we focus on productivity. It's much more important that we focus on responsibility and purpose than we focus on revenue streams, right? I'm not to say that revenue is not important, not to say we shouldn't have an effective business model. I'm the first person who will tell you that you need an effective business model because I worked on that for such a long time. But our business model has to acknowledge where we are in 2024. And where we are in 2024 is that, people right now, nothing is more important than our human relationships, right? Nothing is more important than preserving human agency and preserving human contribution and feeling human empathy. Nothing is more important than that in a world of so much technology, of so little trust, of so much power and money coursing through the veins of our society. It's humanity that needs us and the association community in particular to care about what happens next, because in many ways, I think our organizations are the most human of all the organizations out there. Government is government, business is business. Nonprofit organizations have their things, and maybe they're part of it too. But we're human because from the very earliest beginnings of associations in this country, it was all about bringing people together to do things that they couldn't do individually. It was all about trying to care for one another at the most local level, and eventually it grew to things that became of greater scale, right? National, international, and that sort of thing. And so I think that we've got a really unique responsibility in this decade and in the decades to follow to be about making sure that humanity comes first in a world of more and more relentless technological development and all the other issues that are in play right now and all the serious challenges that we face as this decade continues. We have to be on the right side of that conversation. And that begins with us having more meaningful learning experiences and conversations and processes so we can all better understand the totality of what we face, have a holistic point of view on everything we're confronting, and then move forward together to be able to address these issues. That's really the critical thing that in my work and my focus on learning, I'm trying to communicate, among other ideas.
Thank you for that. I want to go back to that point where you realize that the new knowledge contradict with your prior understanding. My imagination is there might be some sense of confusion during that contradictions. What I'm trying to understand is how do we reconcile the new knowledge and the current knowledge in ourselves? What do we do? How do we process all of these information?
Well, if you think of learning, like, again, this is where I say there is a mental model, right? There's an orthodox belief, let's say, about what learning is, right? That, like for some people, and especially back when I was an association educator, when I was on staff, and I guess I still am an association educator, but when I was a staff person, we talk about learning. Some people found it really a revelation to know that the words education and training are not the same thing, right? And the word learning and training is not the same thing, right? Training is a form of delivering information, helping people build skills and that sort of thing. So if we stop thinking about learning as all learning as training and think about learning as a process of development, it's individual development, it's collective development, right? Then it's a whole different, conversation. And so then you take it to the level of learning is about transformation. Again, the phrase I keep using, putting the form at risk. What we are doing when we are going through learning as a transformative process is we're putting the form at risk enough to then come back and say, how do I reimagine this form, meaning the person, in a whole new way, right? So the very idea of reconciling our previous belief system with a new belief system is one of the major challenges and frictions of the entire learning process. And it requires a willingness to let go of previous beliefs. That's why I focus on orthodoxy, right? That's what orthodoxy is, right? By getting that out on the table, it starts to sensitize us to the fact that we cannot at the same time hold on to a belief system of the past that contradicts with the belief system that is emerging in the present and pointing toward the future. Those two things cannot coexist. What has to happen is you have to look at the previous belief system, the existing belief system, and parse out what's orthodoxy and what's principle, right? What's justified belief, right? Because that's the difference. Orthodoxy are assumptions we make that are not necessarily true. They probably aren't true. They may never have been true at any point. We just bought into them because they were repeated a lot, right? So they were repeated by one person who repeated it to someone else, who repeated it to a third, and eventually it found its way to us. And we just kept on repeating them, right? That's how orthodoxy gets perpetuated. People say it, and it gets repeated over and over again. So that belief, if it's orthodoxy, we have to get rid of that. But what we can pull out of there is what's the principle? What's the justified belief that we hold on to? Because that belief, it's not We don't hold on to orthodoxy. We let go of orthodoxy. We hold on to the justified belief. We take the justified belief and we try to tie it together with our new belief system, right? So for me, as an illustration of my own thing, looking at artificial intelligence in the beginning, my whole belief system was predicated on the idea that the technology itself was the thing, right? Look how amazing this technology is and what it can do, right? But the reality around artificial intelligence is it's not even really about the technology. Yes, the technology can do really interesting things, but AI is a socio-technical phenomenon, right? AI only matters in the context of how it is applied in society, right? And so many other things go into play when you're talking about that, whether it's how we do it, in a way that does not endanger human beings, the people who control artificial intelligence, and that's not a misstatement. There is a small number of companies that exercise almost complete control over the development of artificial intelligence around the world. The power and financial motivations, the regulatory component, and so on. You have to consider all of that in the context of an artificial intelligence conversation. It's not just about, wow, look how cool ChatGPT is, right? And so that process of recombining, of reintegrating one's thinking requires effort to do that. And you have to be, and for me, what I had to do was let go of the focus on cool use cases and look at all the wonderful things that AI could do, and instead have a much more skeptical view, I think it's fair to say, contrarian perspective, right? There's that word again, right? A contrarian perspective on maybe all the wonderful things that AI can do. Yeah, that's great, but maybe we won't be able to do them all for all these different reasons. Or maybe someone who has more sway or more power or more money than us will make a decision that we won't do those things. Instead, we'll do something else, right? Something that they like better, right? So I think that's the way you do it. You learn things, you gather up your information, you gather up your perspective. When you learn more and you start to really think about it as transformation, that reconciliation of your point of view, that reintegration of all your thinking requires letting go of that orthodoxy in favor of being able to bring the principle, the stuff that really persists, that endures, into this new way of thinking, right? So for me, the enduring part is, yes, I still see value in artificial intelligence, right? And so that endures. I'm not saying, don't ever use artificial intelligence. I'm saying, yes, I can still see why people like it. And I'm still willing to go along with the idea that we should think about how to adopt it. But the reintegration is the only way, there's only one way that we can really afford to adopt. And I don't mean afford in a financial sense, I mean in a human sense. The only way that we can afford to do this is with an ethical, purposeful, and responsible orientation to the work of adoption, right? That's the only way, right? And so, that was a fundamental shift. It's not to say that in the past I didn't care about AI ethics. I did. I just wasn't focusing on that. But then the learning piece of this for me really shifted the thinking as I gained more and more information and gathered more understanding and went through my own sense-making, meaning-making, decision-making process over and over again. That's how I came to this place. And I'm just talking about it in this way to answer your question and illustrate how one does it. But you can extrapolate exactly the same thing to any topic or any subject area. You can use this same way of approaching things, and it doesn't stop, right? I'm not finished, no way near finished, right? You never finish. That's the thing. People think you get a credential or, you get a certificate or a course ends, we're done. No, you just finished that part of it. Mm-hmm. Then you move on to the next part, right? Because there's always another part. It doesn't ever end. And I think that in some ways is also the challenge, is people want to know when the conclusion point is. And I have to say there's never a conclusion point when you're talking about learning. Learning is always ongoing. And it doesn't, you can't stop it because the world is not stopping. The world does not call time out and say, hey, everyone take a break, right? That's not how it works. Our learning has to be operating at the same level of intensity as what's happening in the world around us, because we have to keep up with the world. The world does not adapt to us.
It's fascinating hearing your thought process and how it works. I want to flip the coin on these conversations. And I can only imagine that this is going to be a very hard, difficult conversations to have in a boardroom context, especially when you mentioned that the former self is at risk. That's how we have to go through the transformation and the orthodoxies who get into the way of learning to obtain new things. Can you describe to me how this type of conversation goes within a boardroom context? Is there a story that you can share with us?
Yeah, I mean, we could have a whole separate, podcast about just this topic. Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably snippets of different experiences rather than one long story. So yeah, I think the first thing that I would tell you is that I never would ever use the phrase "put the firm at risk" in a board meeting, right? That would never come up,
For
right?
sure. Yeah.
And because no one at that table wants to hear that. And I get it, right? I've been a director and I've been a board officer, and no one wants to do it. There's even though that is what is happening. I mean, let's be clear. That's what has to happen. We wouldn't talk about it in that way with that group, right? That group needs a different way of talking about it. That doesn't mean we don't talk about risk, and it doesn't mean we don't have hard conversations. So, as an educator, I like things that do more than one thing, right? So, for me, the orthodoxy conversation, the reason, a big part, there's several reasons why it's the starting point. One of those reasons is quite literally, if orthodoxy is controlling our decision-making process, if we are captive to it, that's a problem, right? So we've got to start addressing that. And again, that's a never finished kind of thing. It's always an ongoing, it's always a work in progress, right? So there's a starting point there. But the underlying aspect of the orthodoxy conversation is challenging the board to recognize that they've got to always challenge their own assumptions, right? And so the orthodoxy conversation is a thing. It's a discrete conversation in which we try to identify what are the beliefs that are holding us back, right? These are limiting beliefs. We have to do that. And what I say to boards, and this has come up, right? So here's a snippet of a story. I was with a board one time that had so many board members. They had more than 50 board members. And let's be clear, that's not even one of the biggest boards in the association community. That's just a really oversized board, right? And they had 50 board members. So they had so many board members that they actually had an executive board, of about 15 or 20 people, right? So in the bigger conversation, we talked about orthodoxy, right? Everyone, all these 50 or 60 people, including staff and that sort of thing, in a ballroom, doing orthodoxy work, trying to identify orthodoxy, putting stuff up on the walls, covering the walls with post-it notes and that sort of thing. And we come up with a lot of good information and insight. And then my job is to take all of that, review it all, and then come up with a single visualization of the orthodoxies identified by the group, right? So the next conversation after that bigger one is with this executive board, right? So you know what I'm talking about. The people who serve on boards are operators, right? That's who serves on boards, right? Everyone's got a job basically where they're doing something every day. They're completing tasks. They're moving something forward. They're, giving directives to people. That's what they like to do because that's the job they have. And as you know, that's not what boards do, right? Boards operate differently, right? The board process is not about issuing orders and giving directives. It's about thinking and questioning and challenging. And so that's a big part of the mismatch that exists at the board level, especially in associations, right? A little different in the corporate sector, but in the association sector, very, very much an issue. So I put forward an orthodoxy map, that's the visualization that I create, to this executive board. And one of the people on the board will, says to me, what do we do with this? Like, what do we do? And my answer to them is very simple, right? And some version of that question comes up a lot. There's nothing per se for you to do around this. This is about you having an awareness of the fact that these beliefs exist. This is about you having an awareness that every time you sit in this room, you're having conversations in which these and other beliefs are influencing what happens in this space, right? You've got to maintain that awareness. You've got to maintain that awareness when you're preparing. You've got to maintain that awareness when you're in conversation. You've got to maintain that awareness at all times. It's essential that your awareness of this be ever present. So what I always say to them is, and this is true in every situation, boards are not to blame for the existence of orthodoxy, right? Orthodoxy predates any one person in that room,
Yep.
right? It existed decades before. It's just been repeated over time. So they're not to blame for it, but they are responsible for ensuring that it does not get in the way of moving the organization into the future. So if they're going to do something, like when they say do something, what they mean is, do we have to launch a project? Like, do we have to, invest in something? And for me, the do something is you have to think differently, right? You have to talk differently. You have to adapt yourself to this conversation in a new way. And yes, you may have to take on some things where you work with others in the organization. You work with your staff team, you work with your committees, you work with your members, your other stakeholders, and say, look, hey, this orthodox belief exists in our organization. We need to challenge that. We need to push back on this, right? We can't allow this to be the way we think about things, right? So that is a big part of this. There's more, but at least two things that this conversation does is it makes visible this whole series of beliefs that are undermining our organizations. And two, it sensitizes directors and officers and staff to recognize that they must continue to challenge their assumptions. Once the word orthodoxy is in their heads, once it's on their lips, they can't ignore it anymore. I always say that to them. Now that we've talked about orthodoxy, you can't ignore this. You know it's here. You have that knowledge. You need to continue to address this orthodoxy. Even if you never look at this map again, which I hope that they will and they do, even if you never do that again, you still have to know that this orthodoxy is here. How will you continue to work through it and not allow it to prevent you from doing things? So yes, it's a hard conversation. And that's just one of them, right? That you have to have in that board level discussion, because so much of what goes into effective board work is what is below the surface of, like if you want to use the metaphor of the table, right? There's a lot of stuff on the table, right? There's a lot of papers on the table. There's a lot of computers. There's a lot of material on the table above the metaphorical or literal table that boards meet at, whether it's a Zoom meeting or in a boardroom, whatever. But there's a whole lot of stuff below that that's happening, right? That doesn't ever rise to the top level unless we put it there.
Yeah.
And that's what we have to do. And that's what I'm trying to do in my work in many ways, is get a lot of the stuff that is below that sight line of what's happening at the table up on the table, so we can talk about it and make it visible and make it discussable and make everyone in the room responsible for ensuring that is continually addressed.
Thank you for that. I know that we only touched the surface on this, but I really like how you start with the awareness piece, because if we are not aware of that, we will not be able to address how it impacts the work and the growth of association. And the other thing I really like is you start making these pockets of difficult topics become more digestible, the way you frame the conversation that way.
And can I just comment on that for a second? Because that's such an important point that I want to say something about, because more and more what I'm concerned about, is that no one wants to have difficult conversations, right, at the board level. Like, I think that, and the reason why I say that is because there were so many difficult conversations during the worst of the pandemic lockdown, and I was in many of them as a board advisor. I sat there and listened to difficult conversations. People are exhausted. People are burned out. People are tired. And like I said earlier, I wish that the world would be able to just, go on X one day or whatever and say, hey, everybody, 3-month break. We're calling timeout. Everyone can rest for a while, and we'll pick this up in the next fiscal quarter, right? That's never going to happen, right? So we've got to stop wishing for that. And for me, what it's about is we've got to get boards beyond coping mechanisms for things and into places where they can use their agency, right? So the orthodoxy conversation, the point that I wanted to build on that you mentioned, the orthodoxy conversation is a relatively safe, difficult conversation. And what I mean by that is it's all internal stuff, right? It's all stuff that most people already know. They already see it. Like, I do surveys all the time. with boards and that sort of thing. And for years and years and years, I would get people emailing me asking, what is this orthodoxy thing? I don't get it. You know, I mean, why is this important? I'd get pushback. I'd have email chains with people who would say, well, I'm not going to answer this question. You know, I'm like, fine, don't answer it. You know, if you don't want to do it, just put in NA in every one of the fields and move on to the rest of the survey. It's fine, right? That doesn't happen anymore, right? Very rarely does that come up. And the reason why is because I think everyone sees very clearly today in 2024, after everything we've been through in recent years, where the orthodoxy is and what, and they like it more intuitively, not everybody, but on balance, more intuitively, everyone gets it now much more easily than they did maybe 5 years ago and even 3 years ago, right? So this is a relatively safe, difficult conversation. And I want them to have it because there are so many more difficult conversations that are going to happen. We have to build some capacity for having difficult conversations. The AI conversation is incredibly difficult to have. Climate is an incredibly difficult conversation to have. And human inequality and all the other issues that are going to be, if they not already are, on the board agenda for the rest of this decade, including things that are not even on our radar screen right now, and we have to find ways to help them build capacity. The orthodoxy conversation, in addition to all of its other benefits, also has the benefit of being a way to practice and to build capacity for other harder conversations yet to be had that are not going to get easier, right? More upheaval coming in the next half of this decade, more tough decisions. We've got to build capacity for those tough decisions. The orthodoxy conversation helps with that. And then, we have to do more to help with other issues as well.
Thank you for the remarks. And I love how you build safe into that equation as well. When we build a safe enough environment, it's easier for us to be open about discussing and joining the conversation. Let's move to the last part of the conversation. What's next for you in the coming 12 months?
Wow, interesting. I think, it's going to be really an ongoing extension of what I'm doing now. And, with one other thought that I'll add to it in a moment. But, I know that we are just at the beginning, even though AI has been around for a long time. It's been around for a long time as an academic discipline, going back to the 50s. And even before that, as a matter of fiction, and our fascination with robots and that sort of thing. But the AI conversation, we are just the beginning of the AI conversation. We are nowhere near finished with it. And so that's something that I'm going to stay, right in the middle of. And we are, the ongoing process of trying to help our boards get to the place they need to be. I'm all about, helping boards become fit for purpose. And the fit for purpose is, how do we navigate this upheaval of this decade and the upheaval yet to come in the 2030s? And how do we leave our organizations better than how we found it? And how do we, really stand up for our successors' futures, which is what the duty of foresight is all about, standing up for our successors' futures, through intentional learning, through short-term sacrifice, meaning sacrifice today for the benefit of those who will follow us in the years and decades ahead, the long-term view. So that's all going to continue, because that is stuff that is so essential for us as this decade continues. But the addition that I wanted to make, that I mentioned a moment ago, is that my learning process is always something where I'm looking for, your question, right? What's next? What's the next thing that is going to come into this, right? And I think that there are, new forms of technology, quantum computing, and that are on the horizon that become important to all this. There's lots of stuff happening in, synthetic biology and, neural implants and stuff that's being discussed more openly these days. I think that, and it's across all of the 5 words that, 5 sort of forces and factors that shape our society, right? Social, technological, economic, environmental, and political. The acronym is STEEP. And looking at all of those, right, there's always going to be something next, and I think part of the challenge right now is that we're living in a world of polycrisis, right? There's multiple crises all happening at the same time in each one of those areas. Lots of social upheaval on a variety of issues happening. Obviously, technological upheaval happening, even though our economy certainly domestically is strong. There are certainly issues on the horizon in terms of competition between the U.S. and China, and ongoing, political, conflict in other parts of the world that will affect the economy. Obviously, climate is a very precarious issue, for us. And then the politics of things, a rise of authoritarianism. This year, 4 billion people are voting in 2024. Some of them have already voted, but many, many more yet to come. And some of these other forces are going to be in play there. How will AI, wreak havoc in power politics and, create disinformation or misinformation that affects political outcomes? And how will ongoing conflict in Europe and conflict in the Middle East affect things? This is where I'll be focusing my attention on an ongoing basis, not only to see what's happening, to try to help associations navigate those threats in the short term and the long term, but also what's next, right? What is the next 2 or 3 things that are really going to rise to the level of significance of impact in the way that AI and climate and human inequality and ideological extremism have over the last, several years. So that's going to be my focus for not just the next 12 months, but probably for the foreseeable future, to try to help boards and CEOs, senior teams, and other, contributors, staff partners, other contributors to board work navigate this environment and help everyone get prepared, for what's next, and build these fit for purpose boards that we so desperately need in this environment, and make sure our staff partners are right there working with them side by side to move our organizations into the future. So that's my purpose, and learning will always be at the heart of that.
Thank you so much. I admire your bravery in understanding how complex the worlds go, how complicated our people minds works, and you still dedicated your work to work with people, work with association to navigate so many layers of the world. The last question for our episode today. If you were going on a dream vacation tomorrow, what is the one item you would take with you and why?
Interesting. Yeah, I think it would probably be my phone. I know that's not a unique or interesting choice, really, but I think that it's, I think of all the things, because it would be the way for me to have something that would help me navigate that journey, if you will, while at the same time, it would be central to the learning aspect of things for me, right? I could say I'd bring a book, and that might be a more interesting thing for me to say in an interview setting. But I think the reality is that, even as I talk about my concerns about AI, I still think we realize that that device has taken up such a huge position in our lives. And for me, in this case, going somewhere, being able to access information, being able to do learning, being able to, pursue whatever it is I need to pursue to make that a great, trip, take pictures, whatever. I think that's probably the thing. If I thought about it, I'd probably have a more inspired choice, but I think that's a pragmatic choice.
Thank you for that. This is really the end of the episode. Thank you again for your time. I've learning so much, and yeah, it's gonna be fun digesting the information that you just shared with me.
Thanks, V.
That's it for today's episode. Drop your thoughts in the comment section. I'd love to hear your take on the chosen keyword. Have a lovely time, and thank you again for spending time with Humans of Authenticity.